So, this is YouTube intro because I'm going to make this into video using Lucas for content yet again. Is that my new thumbnail and title? Maybe, who knows. But I'm reacting to Lucas's range meat shield theory because this is, what, 5 years ago? Yeah, October 2019. Yeah, I'm reacting to this because I feel like it should come back. I feel like not a lot of people give
So before
not a lot of people know about the stuff in here, but yeah.
I start, I need to
All
remind
for
you all
best
that
meat
I
shield,
will
oh
talk
my
about a
god.
big concept that probably will not help you in the game. Well, it might, but most likely not. If you hear about tricks and tips to help you in the game, you might be disappointed. But
Is
it
this
could
before
help you
Minisaurus?
still. This will
Wait, he's
help you
not
in the
using
game.
Minisaurus with Little
You might
Mohawk.
be
Is this
disappointed,
before
but
Minisaurus was
it
out?
could help you still. This will talk more about a certain theory that I personally find very interesting
Stuck
and
on
just
you all,
fun to
unfortunately.
talk about. It's a trivial matter that rarely has its uses. Granted, there are parts of this theory that may end up being a vital strategy in a level.
I will say about ranged meat shielding, I know he gets into this later, but it's ranged meat shielding is not something that like you go out of your way to do. It's something that occurs that most of the time whenever it's helpful, it just occurs without you really thinking about it.
Whether you know about this concept or not,
They had no
it
Baja
wouldn't
Blast
really
back
make
then.
much of a
Brother,
difference
that
in
came
your
out
playthroughs.
like a
Now,
month ago.
let's get started. Meat shielding, as you all know, is a key strategy
Minisaurus
in Battle Cats.
was
You've pretty much
newer,
known this ever
yeah.
since, like, you look up a guide and...
Why are you using Catway on
Bahamut?
Bahamut?
I don't really need to tell you how important meat shielding is anymore. When we talk about meat shields, the idea of your general meat shields are those units that are like those cheap.
Some people don't appreciate meat
units,
shielding
and
enough.
they have short range. For example, the cat variants or the tank variants, or maybe units like Rover and Artist and so on. Obviously, they would need to be short range so that they can slip in under enemies' attack range, so that they may be able to stall the enemy.
Catway was
from
meta?
advancing.
Really? I didn't know Catway was meta back then.
If have big range, then they wouldn't be able to stall the enemies perfectly, as they will stand.
I think this
outside
is
of
also
the enemy's
before
range.
Cadaver Bear, so
right?
technically Little
So then
Flying was
you
also.
probably would look at the title of this
Wait,
video
no.
and ask,
Little Flying didn't have. Wait. Yeah, no, Little Vet. Yeah, I'm right.
then what the fuck is a range meat shield?
I'm confusing myself.
Meat shield with a range wouldn't work properly, like as you said earlier. Well,
Kind of like a mid-range tank.
You're right. A range meat shield doesn't actually work properly, or at least they don't work like a normal meat shield. It's kind of hard
most
to
of the
start
time
with
won't
this,
actually have
basically
like,
the
meat
range
shield
meat
health.
shield theorem or theory or whatever has it's been pretty interesting to me ever since Caxter made a post about it years ago in the Reddit.
This is.
I would highly recommend.
Is this Reddit? I don't know what I'm looking at, but
For you to go
I'm assuming that's Reddit.
Give it a read.
Reddit looks
now
different.
Or even later after video. I'll link the post.
5th anniversary, yes
now,
sir.
The way range meat shield quote unquote works is that it more or less take on the idea that normal meat shielding are not perfect, and enemies will eventually push, even if it is theoretically possible to
Catway, that's
stall
fair.
the enemies. But even if you use,
it's kind of a shame I never got that ice cream or whatever that fucking unit is he's using here.
If multiple meat shields die together at once in one attack, there's a pretty good chance that the enemy will advance. Now, here is where ranged meat shield comes to play. Like I've said, ranged meat shield indeed doesn't work like a normal meat shield. They are not intended to stall the enemies perfectly. Instead, they serve as like a backup for your meat shield. They're more like a safety
Heavenly Tower is not on for me in 3 minutes. I still have another hour.
net. First, let me take some.
Ever tried beating Bun Bun with just meat shields? Is that what he was trying to do? I doubt it.
More like a safe.
Man, he. Imagine losing to Chapter 3 Moon. Imagine.
Units of range meat shields, namely Fungi Cat, Rope Jump, and the more extreme one, Rampage Cats.
Rope Jump sucks.
Definitely barely seen anyone use these as meat shields, and well, it's because they're really unconventional. They don't contribute much in perfectly stalling enemies, and they're usually more costly, and they're just not that good as your traditional meat shield.
Rope Jump also has a very low crit chance, meaning that you're not even really going to want them against metals. Especially now that Modern exists.
Earlier, there's really like nothing else that isn't terrible. The closest we've got
with Eraser, I guess that would be
and
fair.
the best we got is Fungi Cat's evolved form. So let's talk about Fungi. Fungi has
He's just a fun guy.
2 seconds cooldown, just like a normal meat shield, but a tiny bit pricier.
30
Meat shields are
DPS.
usually around 100 to 150 range. Fungi, however, has 200. It's a very odd number for a meat shield.
This bitch has the same range as Bun Bun.
Fungi in the game so far. Due to standing on an absurdly high range for a meat shield, Fungi may sometimes not work like other traditional meat shields. While other traditional meat shields try to slip under enemies' attack range to stall it, Fungi may sometimes instead hang around outside of the enemy's attack range, outside of their reach, so that they
I
just
love how he's using
lounge
double
around
coup.
there without
Back in the
actually
day
growing
before
an
Coup had
unreal
ultra
attack
talents.
range.
Did
Fungi
Coup
also
even have
has
normal
a pretty
talents at
long
this time?
attack animation, so sometimes it may also target lower range peons and then just stand there for a couple of seconds. This gives fungi a unique interaction with the
Found Little
enemy
Eraser,
compared to
then
how
Little
meat shields
Dark.
usually
Yeah.
interact with the enemy. Like I said earlier, instead of trying to perfectly stall the enemy, it will instead just hang around outside of the boss
Yeah,
enemy's
it's good.
attack
It's good
range.
for a wall
It doesn't
behind your meat
actually
shields,
just
just in
block the
case.
enemies from advancing, it just
It's like
stands
good
there.
for
If
backup,
you're confused on how this
especially
even
in
helps at
stages
all,
where
or
there's
even
like
just how this works in
LDers.
general,
I want to mention this is that LD and Omni Strike enemies are a hell of a lot more common nowadays. So it is helpful to have the extra wall behind your base meat shields, just because like you never know when your front line of meat shields will just get absolutely wiped by something, and then some sort of rusher will come rushing in. So having the semi-ranged meat shields can actually provide a very nice wall nowadays. And I don't think people talk about it, but it would still be nice. The only reason why we don't really I think the main reason why we don't really do it more often is because of cost and because of lack of fast ranged meat shield. Everybody loves Manic Mohawk and Manic Eraser because they're fast. They can get to the front line quickly. However, there's not a lot of ranged meat shields out there, and not a lot of them can provide that same speed. And by not a lot of them, I mean almost none of them. I think all of them are relatively slow. So,
I won't blame you. But let's return back to my previous statement about how this whole thing works on the idea that your meat shielding aren't perfect. At least in a generic situation, your meat shieldings are most likely never perfect. Even CPU won't perfectly stall out the enemies. Now, this is where
this is one of the stages where I think a ranged meat shield would actually help a lot. Because what's happening is Crazed Bird is wiping out the front of your meat shields, but since it doesn't actually have like a piercing range or whatever, it'll hit the front line of your meat shields, but it probably won't manage to hit your range meat shields, at least not as often. So they would provide actually a relatively good wall for this stage specifically. Meanwhile,
range meat
he's
shield
not
comes to
actually
play,
using his range
since
meat
when
shields
the
in that
enemy
stage,
pushes
which
and
is
the next
funny.
meat shield in line is far away,
I did know
range meat
Sudeko
shield
has faster
presents
tech
itself
cycle
as
than
the
Octo.
next closest meat shield instead, being always ready in front of the enemy. Range meat shield
Otters,
would
yeah.
give you enough time to stall the boss for your next meat shield to fill in the gap and continue meat shielding once more.
I think having Eraser on this is kind of misleading because Eraser nonetheless is going to have a thick wall just because he's so slow and with such a quick recharge time. But with Manic Eraser, this is definitely the
Facing the
case.
potential space loss.
It's
Range meat
definitely the
shield,
case for
like
Manic
I said
Eraser.
earlier, is your safety net. I would hope you've caught up until this point. You're
Cat
probably
God,
thinking right now, well, that actually
non-golden
doesn't
Cat
sound
God.
too bad. Why is Fungi such an irrelevant unit when it seems to be the only one to possess this trait very well? The one very obvious reason is because it's not just limited
Kung Fu is only quote unquote better because of having the first attack. That's not and that's still a thing nowadays. That's still a thing. Because he still has that front hit. That's why people use Kung Fu instead of Dancer for floor 30.
limited, it's
Well, used
very
to.
limited. It's
Now
an
that
old
now that
limited collab unit,
Dancer
and
has
for
immune to
that
wave, that's not the
cause,
case.
old players
What the fuck are
probably
these
either forget
units? What am I looking at?
about it or guide
Like
makers
this
doesn't want
fucking
to
freaky ass cat,
use it because it's
and then a tank. What the hell?
super limited, and new players
I
won't
was not
have
around
them.
back then, apparently.
And the other reason is because it may sound decent on paper, but in reality, it's not that simple. For example, one of the
It's
problems
really
is,
not.
like I mentioned earlier, the fact that range meat shields are not traditional meat shields. If you're
Yeah.
going in a level where 3 meat shields are recommended, you might not want to count fungi as your third meat shield, because 3 meat
Yeah.
shields are recommended to stall the enemies as good as possible, but fungi doesn't actually work in a way where it would help on stalling the enemies perfectly.
Yeah. It's kind of like the fact that tanks and mid-range tanks have completely different uses. Mid-range tanks are meant to stay on the field a long while and providing somewhat of a decent DPS while also providing protection to your backliners just in case, you know? However, with meat shields, it's kind of the same thing actually. I don't know why I said however, but it's somewhat similar because what happens is your main meat shields are there and I mean, you're not going to get pushed because they get outranged by everything, so nothing's moving forward. But with your ranged meat shields, things are going to be moving and pushing further just because of their higher range. So they're all they really are is a backup. They're not there to actually be an actual meat shield. They're not there to actually prevent things from pushing. It's to reduce them from pushing. So it's kind of the same thing as having resistant against knockback, you know? It's kind of the same thing as that, except it's, a different unit instead of a talent or whatever.
So it doesn't actually work that well as a third meat shield. Instead, it might work better as a fourth meat shield, and using fungi as a fourth meat shield means that you would be taking up a space. And
Yeah.
generally, it's not
Which
really
is
worth
unideal
bringing
most of the
fungi
time.
in a stage. Usually, there's a much better choice. Another one of the problem is the enemies themselves. Let's say again, Fungi Cat, who has 200 range. For
How
a
do you
ranged
even
meat
get
shield to
Fungi
work
Cat, by the way?
properly, you'd want the meat
Neo
shield
Mushroom
to
Garden Club? I
outrange
have no
the
idea.
boss, or at least the enemy that you want to stall. But there's a pretty small
Back in
amount
the day
of
when
boss
Gold
enemies that are
Cat didn't have a
actually
true
even
form, by the
under
way.
200 range, like the Boar family or Berserkery. One of the most common enemy, Bun Bun, also stands at 200 range, so yeah, it doesn't
Is Bun Bun
really
really one
work
of the
that
most common
well.
enemy?
In the end, in a case-by-case scenario, it's very rare
2016?
for you to actually want to bring fungi in the stage. There's usually better choices. Although, I would say Range Meat Shield works pretty well against like individual strong peons. For example, the Otta variants, maybe Zangru, Shy Boy, and Gory variants, or maybe Steel variants, etc. In the situations like these where you can't fully rely on
Coup
procs,
usage! Or
Range
Wave
Meat Shield
Rider
is
coup
pretty decent.
usage.
Even then, Range Meat Shield also kind of works against like the Boar family because he outranges all of the Boars, but a lot of the time
I think Heavenly Tower provides that imagination for us.
when you're
Oh wait, no, 3 of each Cyclone? No. That,
against Boars, you would rely more on
that would
proc
pass
units and
enemy spawn
abilities,
limit at that
so
point.
meat shieldings aren't actually that important.
Coup usage!
It helps, but it's not that great. Well, that's the more
Yeah.
specific case on fungi, so let's talk about the other range meat shields that I've mentioned earlier.
Figuring out your next
Fucking
steps
ads!
after
I just want to get to the point to where he talks about things like cameraman. That's what I want to get to. Because that's like the main point, I think,
So
with
let's move on to
meat
Jump Rope.
shields.
Jump Rope is
Or
also
ranged
far
meat
from being
shields.
a conventional meat shield. His true form, though, Noodles Cat gains the resist metal ability, which actually makes him pretty decent. Although Noodles is
At the
kinda
time, he
costly,
was decent,
his
I
health
guess,
is
but
pretty
he's
good
kind of
against
jacked.
metal,
He's
and
dog
Split
shit.
Chance also kinda helps
From my
against slightly
experience.
weaker metal enemies. You might see Noodles being used in some places, and you might use Noodles yourself, but you might not realize this. But Noodles outranges every single common metal enemies except for Super Metal Hippo. Super Metal Hippo and Noodles both has the same range.
I didn't
of
realize Noodle had
170.
range.
Every other metal, Noodles outrange.
I never realized
Noodles actually shows a pretty good example of a range meat shield, which unfortunately on this case is specifically for metals only. But fortunately for his case, he actually works. Against the likes of Metal Steel and Metal Doges, Noodles works exactly what the range meat shield theory's idle situation suggests. Outranging the enemy, having
I like
multiple
how
stack
he
of
kept the
them that
pause in
being
there.
able to be just suggest. Outranging the enemy, having multiple stack of them that these things and being able to be just a backup meat shield rather than a normal meat shield, with having a decent health against metal.
What's this
low
music
cooldown,
from?
and
I
not
recognize it,
horrible
but I
for
don't know
price,
where from.
Noodles is a pretty good range meat shield against metal enemies.
Unfortunately
There's really not that much to
expensive.
talk about,
But...
so let's move on to Rampage Cat. Rampage Cat is something else.
unpleasant to look
He
at
has
because
the
it's
2
kind of
seconds
weird.
cooldown of a meat shield and a whopping range of 330. Why is he barely used?
330 range. I did not realize that.
375 cost. Okay, to be fair, this isn't
I like how he mentioned 375 as if we didn't just talk about a 360 meat shield.
insanely crazy pricey, but it's definitely pretty pricey for something that needs to be spawned every 2 seconds to be effective. He has
Yeah,
11k health, which is
definitely.
actually not that bad at all. He could take like 2 hits from certain late game enemies, but a lot of times he just...
Are you really making fun of it the way he speaks? 330. Yes, we get it. He's not American, or he's not like. I don't even know if English is his first language, but I know that he's Indonesian, so it is funny his accent. But I mean, I understand it fine. As long as I can understand it, I'm fine with it. Sounds fun when he says it. It is a cool accent. I like his accent. Is it bad that you want to be duck? I'm
dies
not.
in one shot anyways. And dying in one shot for 375 cost is not
Go ahead,
great.
I guess.
It's just generally not worth bringing at all. Not to mention that Rampage Cat's gigantic
me?
range means that he doesn't really work that well against short range enemies. as the short-range enemies needs to push a total of 330 range to even reach Rampage Cat in the first place.
Yeah. 330 is a bit much because that's mid-range territory. So you're at that point you're not protecting some of your lower range things. Like you are protecting Cyborg, but you aren't protecting things like Cameraman and like some others. Kazujizo is one of the ones that he's not protecting.
That being
That's
said,
just an example,
all of this would have been the case if range meat shields users are purely limited as extra layers of protections. But range meat shields are more than just extra layers of protections, it's more than just a safety net. The range of these meat shields are also helpful when trying to do certain strategies. They can help in a decent amount of other aspects, such as avoiding wave attacks,
I forgot about this topic.
As well as
on things that have short range, but you still want to meat
luring
shield.
enemies
That's
as
right.
Well as much more examples into it, and I'll get into it in a bit. So first let's talk about avoiding wave attacks. This doesn't really work in all wave stages, rather this works more in a stage where there is a mix of generally short range waver and a pusher in one stage. The usage of range meat shield can heavily minimize.
And in this case, you're not going to want to use any other meat shields.
Some examples of these stages are Labyrinth of Hades and all of
so
its
maybe,
remakes.
So maybe if you're doing a stage where you would consider not using any meat shields at all, you can consider using a ranged meat shield.
With the Kori variant as the waver and the Bun variant as the pusher, or Ogre Island with Berserk Kori as the waver and Islas as the pusher. Or maybe even Craze Moneko in Moon Stage, with her being the waver and the boar and the peons being the pusher.
I think Kori was the only common waver back then. That's mainly his argument here.
Since you have a
Kori
pusher
and Kori
stage,
variants.
you're going to want to meat shield. However, meat shields will generally be the reason that a wave occurs in the first place, right? There's usually two reasons on why a wave occurs. One is because the pusher enemy didn't kill your meat shields fast enough so that the waver managed to land a hit. This can be caused due to your meat shields being tanky or as the pusher got hit by a status effect.
So what you don't want to do is use things like Eraser, Medic Mohawk, and all that.
Waver, your meat shield happened to walk inside the waver's attack range and cost
Bun and Kori is kind of an iconic combo, but they're not that bad for the most part. Especially nowadays with Octo, it's kind of less of a big deal. And by the way, I did not know Heavy Cat CAT could solo Black Okame, but it is cool.
Even if the initial meat shield that triggers their attack already died, utilizing ranged meat shield would negate the possibility of the second option to occur. If your meat shields
I don't know about negate, but reduce the chances of it.
Not move inside the waver's range at all, as it will stop on a farther range. This is why I said generally short.
It just reduces the chance because there is still that small chance that the Kori pushes forward, kind of like what we saw earlier.
Insanely huge. As for countering,
and he is still getting very close right there.
This is also a little bit limited.
That in terms of synergizing, I know that's what you meant.
One of the easiest examples are Beverly Hills Scoop's Tackies. Tacky would be more likely to hit your units if there are low-range cats shielding in front.
So it's essentially luring, but without luring.
But you need those meat shields to protect yourself from the Arost, and that's where ranged meat shield can hit two birds.
Not for me, Link.
Well, sorta. The idea is like this. Say if your meat shields has a similar range than your range.
I still have another 45 minutes.
This would mean that they would stand on a similar position. And since they would stand on a similar position, that means that Tacky is forced to move even farther. And that would also mean that Tacky will miss your range attackers. Although
sometimes, depending on their range.
Units. This is obviously not perfect, as in this stage, Arost is a really hard pusher that needs more than just one meat shield to defend against. So you're still gonna need walls to actually meat shield your units, which actually kind of ruined the point. Another more
it's unfortunate, but it's true that these guys are kind of so
using the same concept,
ranged meat shields are just so niche, unfortunately, that like they're so niche and yet they're still so like unnecessary. Like they're unnecessary, I think is the best way to word it. But I think we'll get to the good point here in a minute.
While making your attackers
or so,
from
because there is one point that I really want to talk about.
Here, I'd say
or really,
more onto
maybe not talk about, but emphasize.
Last category, which is about luring enemies closer. So let's talk about that instead. There's so many applications in this one, although the general idea is basically to lure some certain enemy so that your cats
It's actually kind of being shown here, but do you notice something that's happening? It's not just the ranged meat shields that's providing a slowdown for the enemies. He'll talk about this more, but those cyborgs, they're still getting hit, but they're also kind of acting as meat shields against the enemy because it's slowing them down. So that
while
spoiler
still
alert,
being able
but
to meat shield. This sounds confusing.
ranged
I know,
meat shields
so
don't
maybe
have
I
to
should give some
be
examples first. For example, let's
damageless.
take the Haunted 1 LDK. The enemy combination there is Miss Haka and Gravy. Well, a common strategy to tackle this stage is to infinitely knock Miss Haka
Man,
back and not giving it a
I'm
chance
never
to
getting
burrow
Psycho
as
Cat
you chip
talents
away
for
Gravy.
zombies ever
You're
again,
gonna
by the
want
way.
as much attackers
Not
as
with
possible to hit
Housewife.
and knock Miss Haka
If
back
Housewife's
before
an
she
option, I'm
burrows,
not
and ranged
getting
meat shields can
Psycho
help
Cat
too.
talents.
So the problem is this. You'd want to shield your rangers from Gravy, but you also want to hit Haka. However, the usage of short-range meat shields, especially fast ones, would cause Haka to burrow before she even moves in front of Gravy, which means your non-LD units won't get the chance to attack her at the first place. However,
I haven't done this stage
if
in a
your
long
meat
time.
shield's range is big, then Haka will be forced to move in front of Gravy before she can trigger her burrow. This allows your attackers to hit Haka and allows you to shield Gravy at the same time. Hopefully you're
Qatar having single attack targeting while being so expensive is such a scam, by the way.
Mostly only against enemies that has high knockback count or low health. Like I said,
was it still at the time when Musashi was like one of the best non-Uber options for floor 30? Because that was a long time ago.
425's Dolphina is one of the examples, because Dolphina has an insanely huge amount of knockback count. Using ranged meat shield allows you to shield the fishes as well as forcing Dolphina to fight closer to your ranged attackers, causing it to be more vulnerable to your attacks and getting knockback easier. Another example, let's just say using Noodles, and
I can't tell if Cyborg's getting in front of Bondage or not.
Pretty similarly. Not only as it works as a second layer of meat shield, having Noodles also allows you to shield.
Bro, this collab needs to come back. I need this collab to come back.
To get hit by your barrage.
Because Gilgamesh, what collab is he part of?
Revenge stage
is that Face Day Night?
Really good example of an environment where range meat shield works, where you want to meat shield against.
This is yet another stage.
You know, like the Gordies and the Shadow Boxers.
Wait, was Cappy out? Like normal Cappy was Teacher Bear a thing back then? Because I don't know if this happened after this video or not, but cameraman only strat, right? On Cappy Jr. Wasn't that a thing at some point? Or isn't that a thing where you can just like only use cameraman? That's essentially using a ranged meat shield to solo Cappy Jr. So I just wanted to mention that. I don't know if that was a thing back whenever this video came out, but that's a thing now. So that's like another usage of a ranged meat shield actually like being a really good way of using it.
But you also don't want to trigger Baku's attack. Ranged meat shield really shows its potential here, as one Baku attack can really ruin your stack.
Earlier I said this mostly applies to easy to knock back.
I would not say Battle Cats is necessarily kid friendly, but
as you can technically use
kids are going to play it anyways. It's a mobile game.
Enemies with using knockback status effect. Let's just put one example against a waiver, Berserkory. Berserkory has a really tanky health and only one knockback count. However,
Camera Rock? I don't remember Rock being part of the strat. I thought it was just Cameraman.
Berserkory stages, for example, Ogre Island. But this also applies to other stages like Boiling Spring. You could use ranged meat shield to pull Berserkory out from behind JK.
He'll mention Cameraman as a ranged meat shield eventually.
To knock him back. These are just a few examples. Using slow meat shields can achieve a similar results on luring enemies, but we're focusing on ranged meat shields. The thing is, concept-wise, ranged meat shield works better than slow meat shields, but the problem is Fungi is just okay at this job, and
I think the reason why ranged meat shields work better than slow meat shields in this aspect is because they kind of combine being slow while being ranged. So it's not just the fact that they're ranged, it's also the fact that they aren't as fast as the Manics. I think that's another part of it.
The second best thing we got for general
Rock was like 3 frames before Cappy lands the hit, aka perfect stall.
Oh,
okay, so I was wrong.
Never
mind.
What I'm trying to say is that the concept of ranged meat shield doesn't really suck, but the units we currently have that fills their roles are. If by chance Ponos were to give us a unit similar with Fungi Cat or Rampage Cat that doesn't drain your money as bad, then I think the ranged meat shield strategy could have an insanely bigger potential. But what if I told you that all these times of you playing the game, you might have been applying the ranged meat shield theory.
Here it is. This is what I want to
so
emphasize.
Let's shift focus a little away from actual traditional meat shields or the ranged meat shield that I mentioned earlier, and let's talk about attackers. Range stackable attackers, you know the ones, like Paris, Dragons, or even Jizzo. I'm sure you're familiar with these, and there's a good chance you've worked with these units.
I like that he says it like
or
that.
Or maybe like similar units like these. And if that's the case,
I don't even think he says it like that ironically.
Actually had some experience with ranged meat shield theory before. Well, how do you ask? It's pretty simple. These stackable range attackers, when stacked up, pretty much acts like a ranged meat shield. Yeah, that includes dragons and Jizzo. There's been a decent amount of strategies that revolves around attackers being meat shields.
Yeah, look at him using
Some
Mola.
examples are Camera and Sanzo being kind of a ranged meat shield in Trouble at the Mansion.
More so
Cyborgs,
Cameraman.
Drama, etc. and Ogre Island no meat shield strategy. Pretty much all of your attackers shielding Bahamut in Lotso Lion, Camera and Craze Paneko, and even Dragons in Vulcanizer. These units are definitely not your everyday meat shields, and they aren't even your traditional range meat shield. Yet they could work like a range meat shield. These are
Filibuster stack? Man, this guy really tries everything, doesn't he?
Kakazer also mentions this in his Reddit post about how stackable range attackers could qualify as a pseudo-ranged meat shield, as they give an extra layer of protection for every unit behind them.
Pretty much anything that's spammable can work as a ranged meat shield slash meat shield.
They generally have really high cost and are really high cooldown as a meat shield. However, they are
if
much
it gets used, then
more
dies
easy to
immediately.
apply on in common stages, and since they mostly take the role of an attacker, that's again hitting 2 birds in 1 stone. Being a quote-unquote meat shield just happens to be the side effect. If you want another clear example, I would refer you to a run of Jizzo soloing Ogre Island. The range
anytime you're really soloing a stage with something spammable,
makes him both an attacker
like Cyborg
and
against
Alfina
and all
the
that
Jizzo at the
stuff.
front, protecting the Jizzo at the back. And due to having high range, they won't accidentally run into Berserkori's attacks, like how I explained earlier.
That's also kind of the same thing as using Cyborg for Craze Axe and Manic Dark. Because if you use Cyborg there, then what's happening is you're probably using her to stack up against the Bun Bun and like the peons, or like everything that isn't the boss. However, if you still have the money to use Cyborg against Manic Dark and you decide to, then not only are you getting a pretty good chance of getting a Cyborg hit, you're also essentially sending in another meat shield. Because although she doesn't outrange, she can still probably get a quick hit and then get knocked back. And then she'll come back in, get knocked back. So she's essentially another wall for Manic Dark to pass through, especially with his low damage per hit.
Basically, I would say pseudo range meat shield are the closest we got
slept
to a
15
kind of
hours, I'm
meat shield
jealous.
that is actually applicable to common usage scenario, which honestly isn't saying much.
So to wrap it up, I personally think Ranged Meat Shield is just a very, very interesting theory. So far it has
not necessarily a theory,
the
I
lack
don't
of
think.
available units that we have really limits on the potential that we can unlock in the game. I really wish this could have been so much more than what it is, even though it is pretty useful in a lot of stages and a lot of scenarios. But it could have been so much more.
Here, I'll let him finish talking and then I'll continue talking
actually
about it.
match the criteria. So
But
in the
that's
end,
just
a
a
lot of these
game,
are just
game,
impractical.
game.
And with that, you might ask, well, if it's really that
I said that
impractical, then
wrong.
why do you make a video about this? Okay, I've made a lot of videos about stupid impractical stuff.
It's funny that you spent
A
20
lot
minutes
of the
talking about
videos
this.
that
20
I
minutes
think
is
doesn't
long
really
for him.
matter in the end, but it can matter, and I know some people appreciates these kind of stuff.
Well,
And I don't
long
want
for him in a
like,
video. Obviously, I know he gets off topic whenever he's streaming and stuff. So
these
but
sort of stupid theories.
for
and
making a
stupid
20-minute long
strategies
video
that
for
will
it, it's kind of
really
long.
only touch on certain people. Gets
Can he
lost
stop
in
using that cat?
obscurity.
Why
I
do you not
want
like
this to
fungi?
live on. It's weird, I know, yeah, but I just want to.
I'm sure there's people who
You're not listening to me. Heavenly Tower's not on for me yet. I still have another 40 minutes.
appreciate
You're
these
not
kind of
listening to
useless
me.
knowledge, and whether you're one of them or not, I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time.
Yes, sir. Oh, what is this outro? What the? Man, old Lucas. Okay, so range meat shields, right? So he kind of implied that they're not really that useful and that they don't really come in handy all that much or something along those lines. But I want to say that I feel like the most valuable part about them isn't necessarily that they exist, but what they imply exists. Like what am I trying to say? So they show that a unit can have more value than just dealing damage. Cameraman, Cyborg, Manic King Dragon. Or maybe not Manic King Dragon, but normal King Dragon. 400 range. Those 3 units can provide not just damage, but they provide an extra wall that the enemies have to push through in order to reach your backliners, such as Uberun, Manic King Dragon, Crazed Bahamut, all of that stuff. And so having that extra layer of not necessarily meat shields, but just stuff can definitely provide a lot of use in a lot of stages because it gives rushers a different another wall to push through. It gives an extra layer of thickness. You know, the thicker the better. But yeah, I think that's enough time. Wait, you guys said Lucas posted 22 minutes ago. What did he post? That's fine. I can do my homework later. Hey guys, let's look at this.
Hey, I made a custom design for Brook Gaming's Battlecats controller.
Let's
Link
look at
device
this.
in the description. Use the code LTCS1 on either my custom design controller or the white controller to get an exclusive discount and to support me in the process. Okay, to the video now. In Battlecats, damage and health stats aren't the
I just want to preface, I'm only watching this because it just came out. I would have absolutely ended stream if this came out like yesterday, but
only factor
just
when
came out,
deciding whether
so-
a unit is good or not. Another common factor is what abilities a cat unit might have. There are many abilities that can enhance certain stats or affects money or resist enemies' attacks, or abilities that can debuff the enemies. When it comes to debuffs, the main ones that people think of are freeze, slow,
Hey, you want to see
weak
something funny? Hey, you want to see something
enemies.
funny?
When it comes to debuffs,
You guys, chances are he accidentally used a cat's eye on a unit and then didn't upgrade it. I think that's funny. What do y'all think about Momotaro?
the main
Momotaro is
ones that
good,
people
really
think
good.
of are freeze, slow, weaken, and curse. And maybe knockback, but that's a bit of a weird case, but the player's favorites are usually freeze and slow. Units inflicted by freeze will be, well, frozen in place, unable to move and unable to attack until the debuff runs out, while units inflicted by slow will have their speed set to 1, essentially rendering them almost unable to move properly. Both
Only
of
almost,
these
though.
debuffs are very helpful.
I think a lot of people forget that even when slown, enemies can still move. So it's not essentially a freeze. Like they can still move, and they can still push slightly. So like slow is kind of
As it can
overrated
halt enemies
sometimes,
from
I feel
pushing
like,
through your
but
defenses and
still
can
really
save
good.
your cats and your base alike. However, not a lot of people seems to care much about weaken.
Weaken's
I
actually
think
really
is a
good in my
shame,
opinion,
because I think
which
weaken
is-
as a debuff is
I'm sure he's
incredibly
talking about it
powerful
in this
and
video.
to an extent pretty underrated. Weaken is a debuff that essentially reduces the affected unit's damage by a certain percentage. Every unit that have the weaken
one speed is
ability
not
have their
zero
own
speed.
percentage of weaken strength and their weaken duration. Weaken affects extender abilities like wave or surge or explosion, so weaken enemies will also have their extender abilities damage lowered as well.
We can speak showing row on screen. Sorry, I keep moving around because I'm getting comfortable. Showing row on screen made me think about the fact that rows weaken actually can carry through some stages against reds, which is, not talked about enough because like things like Anya and Professor A, them getting weakened is actually such a big deal. So weaken is absolutely really good. Unfortunately, everybody just looks at Ubers and there's not really any good Ubers that weaken. So everybody kind of just like, oh, I have Matama who slows or Kronos who freezes, but there's not really any top tier Ubers who weaken. But now we have Lunacia. So, just saying, we have Lunacia.
If there are multiple units with a weakening ability,
It may not feel as good as Freeze and Slow, but not it's not terrible, like nobody talks about it, which means it's probably, in my opinion, underrated.
applies weaken on top of each other,
And
then the
Professor Cat
older
Jobs is
weaken
also
will
really
have
good.
their debuff overridden by the newest one. By default, most cat units would cut the enemy's damage to 50%, but this does vary depending on the unit that inflicts the debuff. On the other hand, enemies' weaken percentage often varies from one another and by default is generally stronger, usually cutting your unit's damage to a mere 30% or 10% of its original damage. But let's focus on the cat units for now.
Yeah, enemy
Like I
weaken is
mentioned,
fucking
most cat
bonkers,
units
by the way.
weaken will cut the enemy's damage to 50% of its original damage. But some units with certain talents that
Yeah, he
indeed
talks about the
weaken
talents
often
ones.
only cuts to 70% damage, which is not as good as the usual 50%.
Yeah, not nearly as
but
good.
there are rare cases like
Still
Driller,
sometimes helpful,
which
though.
weakens traitless enemies to a mere 10% of its original damage, and Professor Cat Jobs that weakens enemies to a mere 1%, making enemies
Yes,
deal
sir.
nearly no damage at all.
Honestly, I'm gonna say something outrageous. Cat Jobs is one of the best super rares, if not one of the best overall units in the game.
Now, let's have another overview on the uniqueness of the weaken ability. When assuming a quote-unquote
Okay, I'll leave it at super rares because there's a lot of units in the game, but Cat Jobs is one of the best super rares in the game.
generic range debuffer units, weakened debuffers are generally more consistent than freeze and slow.
True.
There's rarely any range freeze debuffer units that can consistently freeze permanently or near permanently on its own.
Bed, you and Scar clearly disagree. You two can fight it over while I react.
The only examples I can think of at the top of my head are Ice Crystal Cat, Nobunaga, Ryder, and Poseidon. And even then, Ryder and Poseidon's freeze duration has a noticeably big gap between the freeze ends and when the next attack.
Yeah, so the way that the three main statuses work is that weaken is oftentimes the most consistent, yet people seem to think that it's the least effective. Slow is oftentimes not as consistent or long as uptime as weaken, but still relatively long sometimes and all that. Still potentially 100% uptime. With but then there's freeze, which is almost never going to be 100% uptime, at least not with one unit, and it's still going to be inconsistent. Most of the time, it's not going to be guaranteed either. So, yeah, who has perma weaken? Well, they're still more consistent. Like I think my argument wasn't that. I hate that that's what you took out of that.
Lands. Their freeze are guaranteed, but it's hardly permanent. Outside of Ubers, the best range freeze units would probably be Seafarer Cat.
Yeah,
who
I
has
think
a
does
really
Thaumaturge
long
have
freeze
perma weaken?
duration
I
and
actually don't
a
know.
nice high chance to proc, but you'd still require a bit of luck to get a perma freeze from him.
Yeah,
and
still
he's
not
more of a
guaranteed though.
mid-range.
Thaumaturge has
His range
guaranteed
isn't really
weaken.
that big.
That's another thing I didn't say is that like weaken users will oftentimes have a really high chance of proccing the weaken. Meanwhile, freeze and slow will typically have lower percentages. Typically.
To freeze, slow is also usually more consistent. Units like Himeyuri, Terun, Kaguya, and Kin Rangers have a very consistent slow debuff, but also doesn't generally perma-slow.
Notice how they're
like
all Ubers
Terun,
though.
or can perma-slow but requires a bit of luck, like Himeyuri. If anything, the better slow debuffers are usually the non-Uber units. Units like Sanzo, Psycho Cat, and Farmer Cat. They too rely on luck,
Farm Boy
but
slows?
they're
I didn't know that.
generally pretty spammable, allowing you to stack them up for a much-needed consistency. Now, weaken units are even more consistent than freeze and slow usually. Lots of common range weaken Ubers would often have a high or guaranteed chance to proc their weaken
exactly
effect,
what I just
and
said.
the duration of the weaken lasts
Farm Boy
quite
is good
long,
for slow. Unfortunately, that's all
usually
he's
long
good
enough to
for,
last
and it's
permanently
only
as
against
long as
angels.
it's constantly reapplied. For example, Ubers like Imagawa Yoshimoto, Ruri, Kachiyama, Nagisa, Pegasa, and Dark Mitama, and Ultra Giga.
Dark Mitama is under talked about. Her weakening can actually be really helpful sometimes. So I feel like she's not talked about enough. He also didn't mention New Lunacia, so I wonder if he like made the script before New Luna came in. Also, hi Cults. But yeah, New Luna is a really good weakener, thanks to her explosion and stuff. So yeah, he's seemingly not talking about legend rares though, so obviously no Luminalia. But I just wanted to mention the New Luna. But yeah, like all of these are really good weakeners, and like yeah, like I don't think there's any arguing on that. Like yeah.
All of these units have guaranteed chance to weaken, and the duration of the weaken is long
You
enough
got
to
to 420 and got
last
bully?
permanently,
Nice.
or
Very
at
good.
least long enough that the gap is almost unnoticeable. Then we got units like Cat Clan Heroes, Grey Fox, Empress Cat, Yami, and Mamoluga. While their duration of the weaken doesn't cover their entire attack cycle, their weaken is still guaranteed, which makes them pretty reliable.
Yeah, guaranteed
And
weaken is
units
a
like
lot,
Mamoluga,
is
even
really
though
common
his
actually.
gap of weaken is pretty noticeable, his range is extremely high. Then we got units like Vega, Kyoko, Mekako, and
New
Emma,
Luna is pretty
who
crazy.
does rely on luck as their proc chance isn't guaranteed, but
Oh, Farm
their
Boy has good
weaken
range, I didn't
chance
notice
is
that.
still pretty reliable, and the duration lasts long enough to have a potential permanent weaken with a good enough luck. These are very common
Yeah.
patterns for
And I will
to
say,
have a
the ones that he's showing here, they all have other things in addition to their weaken. She has wave blocker and weaken against literally anything with a trait. I believe, I could be wrong, but I'm fairly certain she weakens anything with a trait. Makako is a really good anti-alien in general, not just for her weaken. Like she has other things going on for her. Doesn't she have like knockback against red? I don't actually know a lot about her. So less so her, but and then Vega has strong against anything with a trait and target against anything with a trait. So it's almost as if the 50% or lower weaken chance is actually like it's almost like a balancing factor. Knockback weaken in second form, I believe. Okay. So this one's not really a good example of that, but I just don't know her very well. But all the others, I think you can see where I'm coming from.
potential permanent weaken with a good enough luck. These are very common
Momotaro
patterns
can
for
weaken and
movers
freeze?
in general.
Yeah, but
Either
then the
their proc
weaken
sense is
overlaps the
guaranteed,
freeze
or their
and
duration lasts long
I'm-
enough for a long
yeah.
time, or sometimes both at once. This is not always the case, of course. Some Ubers might still have inconsistent and / or short weaken duration, but often it's because the weaken might just be an extra bonus for those units' strength. Now, when it comes to non-Ubers, it's a little complicated. Most
Yeah,
generic
I agree.
ranged non-Uber weaken units are actually usually not that great. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are
It's because they're most of the time talents. You most of the time have to spend your talents in order to weaken things because, like, what? Psycho Cat, Sanzo. I'm sure there's others, but I can't think of them. Like,
few great
yeah,
ones, but
Luminalia's
let
weaken
me
definitely breaks
explain
aliens.
through examples. Units like Sanzo and Psycho Cat can be given
Oh
the
yeah,
weaken
Shigon does
ability
have
through
weaken
talents,
talent.
and they're pretty consistent. However, their weaken only cuts to 70% damage instead of the
Yeah.
usual 50%. On the other hand, units like Driller
Soap is
and
not better than
Catshot
Luminalia. Luminalia still has 7k DPS at level 30. So Luminalia is still probably better, but you can use them both together.
have very powerful weaken strength, cutting the targeted enemy's damage to a mere 10% and 1% respectively. But both of these units have a hard time being used properly. Driller has a huge blind spot, is single target, and only targets traitless, while Catshops is absurdly slow and has a very long cooldown with very terrible stats. They're still amazing if you
Wait, what happens if... Wait, I just realized something. Slow slows a unit down to the speed of 1. What the fuck happens if Cat Jobs get slowed? What happens to Cat Jobs if he gets slowed? Wait, I never thought about that. Does anybody know change? That is so funny. That is so funny. I never even thought about that.
can't find a way to use them,
Well,
but their
Mamaluga doesn't even move, so that one's understandable.
usages are generally limited. And then there's a lot of other weaken units that are just generally not great. A lot of them comes
Yeah,
from
Cat Jobs
overlapping
weakens to
stuff,
1% though.
But most of these really don't matter because we have one non-Uber unit that's just really good at weakening. I am of course talking about the true form of
Thaumaturge.
Onmyoji Cat, Thaumaturge. Thaumaturge has a guaranteed chance to weaken
Right.
all non-metal units for a whole 7 seconds, while having an attack frequency of
I didn't
34
realize that
seconds.
was 7
Her
seconds,
weaken duration
goddamn.
is stupidly long, and her proc chance is guaranteed. And on top of that, she targets every non-metal trait, including traitless, which rarely have a counter. She also has a good standing range and good cooldown and good cost too. And on top of that, Tauma also have talents for way
Okay, so 0.5 speed is a thing? I don't know. I don't know if 0.5 speed is a thing.
immunity, which is
Why is she
really,
single
really
target?
good. Her main
Because
problem
it's a fucking rare. There's got to be some sort of balancing factor. So single attack type is
are
fair.
that her starting attack animation is very long, so she might miss or get interrupted before she lands her weaken. And also she's single target, so she's not too great on a big group of enemies. But it is possible to weaken multiple enemies with Tauma if you stack her up. So here's the
Yep.
thing, pretty much every non-Uber weaken unit will have to compete against Thaumaturge. Tauma is basically the benchmark for non-Uber weaken units.
Except for the metal. Is it drum core? I don't get drum core. Yeah, it's drum core. Against metals, this guy is the best. Metal weakener. 40% chance for 6 seconds, meanwhile attack frequency is really quick. And somewhat spammable, I guess, but like 220 range against metals. Oh yeah, it's also multi-hit, by the way. So you get this 40% chance twice. So against metals, drum core cat, obviously, but other than that, and Mochi.
That's a rough competition, given Tauma already targets every trait except metals and has the wave immune talent. Good luck trying to outperform
Oh yeah,
that.
and wave
Catch-ups
immune.
and
That
Driller
that
has
helps a lot
much
as well.
stronger weaken, and Driller has a very high standing range, so they definitely can find stages where they outperform Thaumaturge. But most of the other time, Thaumaturge is usually just a go-to for mid-range weakening unit. But yeah, that is the case for generic ranged weaken units. But there are also other many weaken units that are aren't generic range cats. Sushi, Sadako, and Soap are all
Yeah,
specialized
thanks.
tankers for red,
Yep.
floating, and alien respectively. But on top of that, they can also weaken their target enemies.
Which
These
effectively
units' chance to
increases their
weaken isn't
HP by
really
a
that
lot.
high, but the duration of the weaken is pretty long compared
And
to
since
their
they already
attack.
tanked, they're probably going to get the weaken eventually.
Anti-zombie meat shield, when talented, can also apply weaken. Though his chance of weaken is very small, but it does help that Shigong is very spammable and has a 3-hit multi-hit, so he can still proc the weaken pretty often. Super Cat and Heavy Assault CAT are all also
Cheerleader doesn't weaken. What do you want about? Yeah, cheerleader in space don't. They're crit.
units that can apply weaken to their target traits, traitless and black respectively. However, they are melee rushers instead of tankers. Super Cat has a guaranteed weaken chance but a somewhat long-ish cooldown and single target, while CAT are more spammable but has a somewhat low chance to weaken. All of the previous units
But in addition to his weaken, he also has massive damage. So it's worth mentioning that a lot of the time the weaken is lesser because the unit itself has other benefits.
that I mentioned, minus Super Cat, doesn't really have a high chance to weaken, but tankers and rushers are able to hit enemies that Thaumaturge normally couldn't. Generally high-range enemies that are usually outside of Thaumaturge's reach. So as a weakener unit,
True,
they still
yeah,
have
it is
usages
talented
on
as well,
stages
that's fair.
where Thaumaturge cannot work. Still,
Oh yeah, untalented CAT actually still weakens, right? So never mind about that. I guess you can use CAT for its weaken without talents.
though, even with these nice selection of units with the weakening ability, weaken is generally not considered to be the preferred pick by a lot of players when it comes to debuff.
Yeah, Tabby, I agree a lot with that. I will. I'm assuming he mentions that in this other 20 minutes that he has.
I see a lot of players would often lean towards unit with freeze or slow when it comes to searching.
I think
debuffs
slow
for some of their
overall is
cat
the
guys,
best
and
because
often
it's
forgetting
typically
the
a good balance of consistency while also being really strong. But you know, a lot of people think that this is true. But just because of balancing factors, I think that slow is still better than freeze. And then weaken honestly isn't that much worse than the other two.
existence of weakening units at the first place. But why is that? Why do
Yeah, knockback sucks. Like nobody uses knockback unless like it's
people
very
generally
niche.
not gravitate towards weak?
I don't want to say it sucks, but it can be nice. But whenever it comes to status to protect your own units and stuff, like I'm not considering
Honestly,
knockback.
I'm not too sure. I mean, it's not like weaken isn't without its faults. Weaken can't work against enemies that hits too hard, like the OG Cyclone Trio or some other super fast hitting enemies. And a perma-freeze is almost just always better than perma-weaken. Although, like I mentioned,
but perma-freeze is almost
generally
never.
more rare than perma-weaken, but if I have to guess, people just don't usually take into account that most freeze units are less consistent than weaken. Not to mention, I think weaken isn't as flashy compared to freeze and slow. If you inflict an enemy with freeze or slow, the effect is immediate and very obvious.
True. Knockback with multi and surge, or yeah, LD and all that. Yeah, knockback can be good there. But for the most part, you're not going to go out of your way to find a unit that knocks back. You know what I mean? Like if you're struggling with a stage or whatever, you're not going to be like, oh, I need somebody to knock them back. You know, that's not typically what you're going to look for.
Yes, but for the untrained eyes, that sounds very demeaning, that's not what I meant, but for people who aren't massive nerds like me, enemies that are hit by weaken might look like they're functioning normally. It's a bit difficult to judge how much a weakened enemy is actually performing, and so I think a lot of players can't tell if the weaken is actually even doing anything. But, well, I mean, that's just a theory that I have, you know, it's a cat theory, thanks for watching. Okay, so anyways, something that I probably should also get into is...
I hate that that's not even a MatPat reference anymore. It's just a game theory reference now, not a MatPat reference.
Well, how does weaken help compared to other debuffs anyways? I mean, it sounded like as if weaken is always worse than freeze or slow, right? And it's only better at being consistent.
Sometimes
but
it is
that's
better
not
though.
Even really true. Yeah,
I think that thinking that this is a linear, better, greater, whatever, equal to whatever, I think that that is bullshit. They are not equal by any means. They are not greater, but they are also not greater or equal or less than each other by any means. It depends on the stage, and there's a lot of stages that benefit weaken over slow, or benefit slow over freeze, or benefit freeze over weaken, whatever. Uh, Freeze is the best, yeah, but think about the balancing factors. Freeze is not definitely the best, thanks to the fact that freeze is balanced around the unit, or the unit is balanced around freeze. And so typically freeze isn't actually going to be all that great with the unit. Think about Chronos. If Chronos had slow instead of freeze, then it probably would have been 2 seconds slow instead of 1 second, instead of a 1 second freeze. Meaning that she would have a much longer proc with slow if it was slow instead of freeze. Probably. I am assuming. But you know, that's something to consider. 1.5, that would still be a lot better. That would still be another second and a half of, you know, slow. And so you know, this is not him saying that this is how things are, because
and
if
it's
you
only better at being consistent, but that's not.
this is how he thinks it is. It always depends. Freeze is always at the top. No. I refuse to believe that freeze is definitively the best, mainly because of balancing reasons. You have to with freeze, you have to consider the fact that thanks to how good freeze is on its own, the unit that has it is going to be balanced around it. And so it's, you know, it's going to be that kind of thing where, you know, you may prefer a perma slow over a 60% uptime freeze. You know what I mean? Like, in a vacuum, freeze is the best. Yes, because I mean, compare perma freeze versus perma slow versus perma weaken. However, you know, freeze is a lot less consistent than slow, and slow is a lot less consistent than weaken typically. And so, you know,
Even really true. Yeah, the consistency helps a lot on why Weaken is so good, but Weaken as an ability itself can still help a lot. Weaken's usage depends on the units you're using it with. For example, Weaken can help meat shields. Weakening enemies helps a lot if you're bringing
True.
tanky meat
True,
shields
Tabby.
like Eraser or Ramen or Shigong, stuff like that. A weak meat shield that dies in 1 hit might now take 2 hits to die, and a meat shield that dies in 2 hits might now die in 3 or 4 hits instead. Once that dies in 3 hits might now die in 5 hits or 6 hits, and so on and so on. If your meat shields are strong enough, you could potentially just never let enemy advance as long as they're weakened. For example, Borofim, the Angelic Boar, needs a certain amount of hits to kill a Ramen Cat, right? If your Ramen isn't strong enough, it would die before the next Ramen Cat arrives, and Borofim can push through in between those gaps. But by weakening Borofim, your Ramen can survive up to twice as long, potentially long enough for the next Ramen to arrive and take the previous Ramen's place, allowing you to stall Borofim indefinitely as long as the weaken is active. And remember,
I think that a lot of people actually overlook the fact that a 50% weaken has the same effect as giving your units strong against that enemy. And so, since weaken can target literally any trait and it can benefit literally all of your units, then I feel like a lot of people just overlook that as support and just think that, oh, you know, slow is better and all that. But it
this is all
depends on the
possible
stage.
with just a single Thaumaturge. A single Thaumaturge can guarantee Ramens to perma-stall Borofim. Weaken on tanky meat shields like these are
And
extremely
that is in addition to resistance and already strong against and stuff. So, you know, I feel like people underestimate the effect of having your enemies damage.
powerful. Remember that Thaumaturge also has traitless targeting, so this also works against enemies that
Yes, Tabby.
Thaumaturge outranges like Manic Mohawk or Arost. If you're having trouble stalling Arost, Thaumaturge might be your answer. Getting your erasers to live an extra hit or two
That is
helps
true.
a
I never
lot in
do it,
slowing
but
down
that
the
is
pushes
true.
of these enemies. Of course, it's not as simple as halving the damage output of the enemy.
Thaumaturge is not used anymore, probably just because she's forgettable. I always forget about Thaumaturge. But
As usually there's like other enemies in the stage that would contribute in damaging your
It would-
meat shields that
she would
might
still
not
provide
get weakened.
use.
Like Manic Mohawk has 2 backliner enemies that can also damage your erasers heavily, and even Borofims are often
4-star
paired with
UL is
other
late
angelic
game.
enemies. But weakening just one of the main pushing power in the stage already helps a lot in slowing down the enemy's advances, and is absolutely worth using still given the consistency. Now, similar to tanky meat shields, another unit archetype that also works well with Weaken are tankers. Okay, this one's almost the same as tanky meat shields. You know, Weaken helps with allowing these units to survive longer, etc. But like I've mentioned before, there are tankers that have a built-in Weaken ability as well, which usually comes in handy against enemies that Thaumaturge can't hit. Since the tankers can apply weaken, the tankers can survive longer. The longer these tankers stay alive, the more chance they get to apply their own weaken ability. It is a
Yeah, Thaumaturge does have a good range, and also everything he's saying is actually really accurate, because that's something that this is exactly why Octo does good against Perfect Cyclone and why Ro does good against Professor A, is the fact that they weaken and then they get more chances to weaken and then they continuously weaken. And that not only helps the tanker itself, but it also helps your other units to get in there and do whatever and all that. And I'm sure he'll mention it.
This allows not just set tankers
Huge
to survive
hermit
longer,
usage!
but it also allows other units
Let's
to
go,
survive
huge
longer
hermit!
too, including units that might just not be there for stalling, but also for damage. This includes tanky units like Island or Jamira, which are tanky damager units, or even units like Royal Guard, Dark Laser, and even Courier, which might not even be a tanker in the first place, but have a tanky enough health and knockback resistance. Some of these units might classify kind of like a rusher units, and weakening the enemies can allow
Courier can get a hit in on Professor A even sometimes without the weaken, but with the weaken it definitely helps.
these types of like rush units to survive long enough to deal more damage or to have enough time to land a hit at the first place. This is one of the main bases on how Courier works versus Professor A, especially against the Relic B stage. Professor A can normally repel Courier as its attack is strong enough to knock Courier back every hit, but a weakened Professor A needs 2 hits to knock Courier back. Now when Professor A is weakened, Courier can tank a hit without getting knocked back and is able to land a hit without getting interrupted, and a single hit from Courier.
Okay, maybe I was wrong about the whole Courier getting a hit in without it being weakened, but whatever.
Lot of damage. This is how you can use weaken as an offensive tool. Speaking of tankers, this would also apply to the best tanker in the game, your very own cat base. I have a whole video talking about base tanking and how powerful it is, so watch that if you're interested.
I think base tanking is really powerful, and it's also like overlooked as like an actual strategy. Some people just do it without even thinking about it, which includes me up until I watched his video on that. So definitely check that out.
Base as a pseudo tankers to protect your units, and weakening enemies
on low magnification.
To be utilized longer. There are 2 weakening units in particular that synergizes a lot with base tanking, which are Professor Catjobs and Mamoluga. I talked a little bit about Professor Catjobs in the video.
You didn't even mention the Paragon cat.
Catjobs here, as Catjobs is
I think it's funny how he didn't even mention the only other unit that has 0 speed, which is Paragon.
kind of a one-of-a-kind unit that kind of disassociate itself from the weaken ability. It is kind of like a closer to a gimmick unit, similar to the likes of Healer Cat, if anything.
Did he specify weaken? He may have specified weaken units that synergize well with base tanking, but I thought he meant in general. Maybe I'm not gonna back up, but I could be the dumbass here.
Now, Mamoluga is a Necoluga Uber with 0 speed. He cannot move away from the base, and his main job is to just protect cats that are near the base. But at the same time,
I just thought it was funny that Paragon wasn't even mentioned as
its weaken
a base tanking benefitter.
Aside from base tanking, weaken can just keep your base alive for longer to, you know, not lose. Some enemies like Taki or Haki or Mina often tries to aim at your base immediately, and once they set sight on your base, you're basically on a time limit to try to get these
get it basically
units off of your base or killed as soon as possible. But alternatively, if you can weaken these enemies, it'll allow your base to survive twice as long as usual, which would significantly lower the amount of pressure you have on your base, effectively kind of doubling your time limit. Another case for weaken is if you want to keep your wave blocker units alive. Units like Cat Machine and Octopus are wave blockers, and if you use them in wave focus stages, their main priority is to stay alive as long as possible, no matter what. Having a unit that can weaken the waivers or whatever enemies is in front can help a lot. Keeping your wave blocker alive is at utmost important. And you know what this ties back into? That's right, Thaumaturge's wave immune talent. Well, yes, ideally the wave blocker should also protect Thaumaturge. Thauma's wave immunity helps a lot in initializing the weaken and surviving whenever there's gaps in the wave. Sometimes things might not go your way and your wave blocker might die early.
And then he can also provide usage as a ranged meat shield, or she can.
Thaumaturge can still live live even without the wave blocker active. Not only that, Thaumaturge weakening waivers also helps if you're not utilizing wave blockers at the first place. Some stages tries to counter wave blockers hard, and in those cases it's possible to maybe just
Now,
not
don't
bring
use her on
wave blockers
every
and
stage,
just
just
tank the wave
acknowledge
with
the fact that
stronger
she
units.
still has
Weakening the
usage.
waves grants your non-wave immune units better survivability and tanking capability, allowing your units more chance to reach the front lines and do whatever they need to do. Now, the benefit of Weaken isn't really limited to just tanky units though. This benefits any kinds of units that can survive an extra hit thanks to Weaken, even if they're not really that tanky. For example, there's a strategy in beating River Styx where you want to
This
purposely
is
Tanya with
mentioning the
ICATs, but
Bahamut thing
sometimes
with
this
River
might
Styx.
not go
Yeah,
your way
he does
and
mention
your
it.
ICAT might get hit. In this case, if your Sushi Cat weakens Hanya, then ICAT at a certain level is able to survive an extra hit, allowing you to continue the permafreeze chain even if you mess up, basically giving you an insurance of some sort. The benefit of Weaken also includes
ROS
giving
about to fuck him up.
range unit supports too. Range units, attackers, and supports alike can benefit a lot from Weaken, especially if they have a lot of knockback count. Sometimes some enemies just hits really strong that they would take multiple knockback counts at once, but by weakening the enemies, this allows your ranged units to survive for much longer by maximizing the amount of knockback counts that they can use. So range weakener units can help themselves to survive longer. You can get units like Dragon or Paris to survive longer, and even Uber units too might have a better chance to survive, especially ones that have loads of knockback count like Dahlia-san, Windy, or Shishilan. Ultimately, these units
I love how
surviving longer
Dahlia-san
can
has
also
7
mean
knockbacks.
a better total of damage output on the field, so this too
I
helps
love
in
it.
increasing your
Dahlia-san's
offensive capability.
such a
And
funny
in a way,
fish,
also
but so
saves
good
your
as
money.
well.
Now, those are cool and all,
Sure, Charmin.
but there's still one more thing. There's one more unit archetype that Weaken helps with in a
7
way
is a
that's
weird
sort
knockback
of
count.
absurdly good. You've already heard about how Weaken can be used offensively to help tankers and damagers to life longer, but you might say that this is something that Freeze can already do too, right? You know, just to stop enemies from hitting your
Mention
units in the
balancing
first place.
factors.
Well, Weaken has a very special interactions to one specific archetype that can be
Wait, is it going to be the fact that if something's frozen, its TBA is actually not unaffected? Is he going to mention? Is he going to mention that while a unit is frozen, their attack frequency does not get frozen? You don't think he will? It's a fact though, right? I'm not going crazy about this though. Whenever an enemy is frozen, or I think a unit in general is frozen, and they're not in the mid. Well, I don't even know if it has to be not being in an attack animation, but it is super niche. It is something that you will almost never notice, especially if you're not paying attention. It is a fact. Okay, I'm not crazy, but it is super interesting the fact that whenever a unit is frozen, their attack frequency is unaffected, meaning that it will still count down to the next attack. They stay as they were before they were frozen, not the attack frequency. The attack frequency will not freeze.
extremely destructive if used properly. And of course, talking about rebound units. Rebound unit is a type of units in Battle Cats that generally has a long ending lag in their attack animation, but in actuality is already ready to attack. Some common examples are Fishman, Bullet Train, Heavy Assault CAT, Awakened Bahamut, Kalissa, Yukimura, and many more. Technically, this also applies to units like Yulala, ICAT, and Bomber, but I want to focus more of the Damager type units. Now, these examples I gave earlier, they have this long, resting animations after they attack, where they would have to wait a little bit after attacking before being able to move. This is often referred to as backswing.
Oh, he's going to mention
Once
that
they're
weakening
done with
allows
their
them to get more
backswing, they're able
knockbacks.
to
That's
move
what he's
and
going to
can
mention.
Immediately attack again. However, if they were interrupted one way or another during their backswing animation, they can just instantly attack. These interruptions can come from the knockback ability, the warp effect, or maybe the boss spawn knockback, or the natural damage knockback. Now you see where I'm going with this, yeah? This
I'm
means
assuming-
that weakening enemies can allow these types of rebound rushers to rebound a lot
Yeah.
more than usual. Yes, the advantage is still basically the same as
It makes
others,
sense that he
allowing
talks
your
about
units
this
to
instead of
survive
freeze
twice
because
as
the
long,
freeze thing
yeah,
is
but
interesting,
rushers are
but
balanced
it's
in a
not
way
the
that
topic
they're
of the video.
supposed to die fast.
But I
They're
still
supposed
think
to
that
just
that freeze
go
thing
in,
is really
hit enemies
interesting.
once or twice and then die. But weakening the enemies allows them to deal so much more damage. Yeah, technically, like in the case of other
Also, one of you guys said you couldn't hear me earlier. Or was it that could you not hear me or the video? Am I loud? Am I loud or is the video loud? Or is it fine? I don't actually know. Fine volumes? Okay, well, okay. I'll slightly turn it down. But yeah, CAT works well with that.
Also dealing more damage because they survive
Has
for
Lucas
a
ever-
longer amount of time.
Has Lucas ever mentioned the freeze thing? The freeze with the attack animation or attack frequency thing? Has he ever mentioned that ever? Because I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about it.
But in the case of rebound units, the amount of damage that they can deliver is done in a significantly shorter amount of time. They don't just survive longer, they also attack
Too
faster.
niche? Okay.
And if you can rush down
But it
enemies
is
in a
very
short
interesting.
span
Like,
of
it's not something
time,
you're going to
that can
rely on,
often
but it
lead
is
you to
interesting.
destroy a lot of stages beyond recognition, which is
I like how you can't even see Driller.
why rusher type units have been meta for a while recently, and not to mention with the very recent Bahamut Blast talent, keeping Bahamut alive longer can be stupidly
Oh wow, Baja Blast. You know, the video that first blew up my channel.
destructive. Also, remember that damage knockback isn't the only way to abuse rebound. This also works if the enemies have
YouTube, you saw nothing. I'm not using an
knockback
ad
and
blocker,
warp.
you are.
Weakening enemies with these abilities can trigger rebound on units that has one knockback count, like Bullet Trait. And well, this also helps with like, you know, non-rebound units to survive longer too, so that they can reposition. But it's just so much more powerful on rebound units. Maximizing the amount of damage you can deal with what little time rushers live can destroy enemies incredibly fast. Also remember that Heavy Assault CAT, being a rebound rusher, also has a chance to weaken its target trait. Similar to how weakening tanker can help themselves to survive longer.
I love Heavy Cat CAT. I used to much prefer Pizza over Heavy Cat CAT, but Heavy Cat CAT has grown a lot on me.
Freeze cannot really replicate to an effective degree. Freeze does allow these units to survive longer, but does not help with resetting the attacks of any of your rebounder units. If a unit's backswing is long, the freeze might not even
Freeze can
last
actually
that long
sometimes
until
harm
the
somebody
unit
that
can
has
land
a
with
low
extra hits,
attack
if
frequency,
at
because
all.
then the
On top of
freeze,
that,
if it's
when
not
utilizing
permanent,
freeze
it'll
on an
probably,
enemy with a
like,
long
against the
time between
sloth,
attack, you
it'll
need
make you
to
think
keep
you're
in
safe
mind
for
that
longer than
freezing
you are.
enemies during their attack cooldown doesn't do anything. You need to time your
Yeah,
freeze
his talent,
specifically
Heavy Cat CAT
right
talents
as
are
when
really
the enemy
nice.
is about to attack to make the most out of it, which can really complicate things. This is also a concept I've covered before in my Bahamut video, so watch that if you're interested. Also, keep in mind, like I said, you need to actually time your freeze. This is something that not just random freeze units can do. It needs to be either from a reliable source of freeze that you can manually set up to occur on demand, like Doron, or to an extent something like iCat or Bombercat.
The freeze downtime? That's not what I was talking about, though. What was it? I guess he technically did talk about it, but like indirectly, he talked about the fact that in order to actually delay an attack, it has to be mid-attack animation rather than just at any time. Which is actually an interaction I never thought about. If it was the other way around, or if it wasn't that way, you could just freeze something and you wouldn't actually have to time the freeze, which would make freeze much better. Huh. Interesting.
Or by utilizing the Thunderbolt cannon. These freeze-on-demand units are
Wait, I want to look at that. That timing on that freeze is actually crazy. Because
very rare. Using the Thunderbolt cannon, or to an extent something like
Hold up.
iCat or Bombercat.
I want to look at
or
this.
by utilizing the
Freeze would have been broken, but I'm not. He's just, just predicting the timing, casually predicting the timing of a sloth. It hasn't even started its attack animation yet.
Thunderbolt cannon.
He's just fucking crazy. He's him. Lucas the Fourth is him.
Are very rare. Otherwise, you kind of just have to rely on luck.
Pre-firing Thunderbolt is hard. I've tried it before. It's not easy to predict. Some enemies.
Be necessary. Still though, sometimes you might just get unlucky, or you really want certain
Malevolent Dart, by the way.
Weaken on demand
usage?
are actually even.
Why is there no
more
weaken
rare
cannon?
than
Probably because not a lot of people
not to
demand
mention
it
there
or
is
want it or
no
whatever.
Cannon head for
Yeah.
weaken, so you're just gonna have to rely on cat units for this. There are a couple of candidates for these weaken on demand units. The main ones being Super Cat, who has a very fast speed and guaranteed chance to weaken traitless, and
Only
the other
targets
one
traitless,
being no other
unfortunate.
than the one and only Seractes. Seractes has a conjure ability that can weaken all traits, so as long as Seractes is on the field, you can decide to apply weaken anytime on demand after a short delay by using his conjure. I've mentioned Mamoluga before too. Man, after a short delay,
For a second, I thought it was Oni Earthshaker that was dodging. No, it was the summon.
But Mawaluga's Conjure actually goes on for a very long range too. Weaken on demand,
yeah, this guy knows
extremely powerful.
This guy, Lucas is really like I could never pre-fire against not Syracuse, Sloth,
right as you
but Lucas is just him.
Their damage. Spawning rushers together with a timing-based weaken can net you some insane extra damage.
Yeah, Supercat helps a lot on 440.
Very powerful aspect of weaken on demand is the ability to waste enemies' attacks. Let me explain what this means. Some enemies, usually backliner bosses like Random variants or slot variants, have attacks that are meant to destroy your units in one shot.
Yep.
But in return, these enemies
casually one-chain you
long time between attacks.
Yep.
With freeze, you're able to
not
just
that hard,
slightly delay this attack,
still,
giving your units
you know, still something for late game.
More damage. But in the end, you're just slightly delaying the inevitable. But with weaken,
I always forget that this boss is weak, not weak, metal. I always forget he's metal.
Until the next time the enemy attacks. This can delay your unit's death significantly longer than freeze. The best part is you don't need to apply the weaken for a long time. As long as your weaken is applied right as the enemy attacks, you've successfully wasted.
Man, if this was one of my hot topics, I would have not even been able to compare it to the way he's talking about this.
Absurdly rare. Honestly, I kind of believe that the power of how good weaken on demand is legitimately probably the reason on why Ponos have not.
He's far better at this kind of thing than I am. If I tried to talk about this, I would not have nearly as much to talk about, and I would not know what the hell I was doing. I mean, I know he spends like a lot of time making like scripts and stuff, but like I could never script.
Made a weaken cannon yet. Like they're
yeah,
okay with
like I mean
Thunderbolt cannon, but weaken on demand is
I know he's done this for a while, but
so
goddamn.
much more destructive. To the point that maybe Ponos deems it to be so good that they decide to not make it a thing. And instead, they made the true weaken on demand units behind Syracuse far away in ZL in the endgame to kind of counteract on how good weaken on demand is. Or maybe Ponos just forgot that we don't have a weaken cannon. To be honest, that's also very likely given their track records. But
that is very likely with Ponos, unfortunately.
A lot of weaken-based units gets overlooked when people try to choose for debuffers. Picoluga, Pegasa, Yoshimoto, Vega, even units like...
I don't like that he mentioned Pikaland because Pikaland's known for his freeze, not his weaken. So I kind of don't like that he mentioned Pikaland there, but at the same time I understand it. Because Pikaland does have the weaken that goes after the freeze. But I feel like he should probably go more into depth about Pikaland. And the fact that he didn't mention Pikaland because of the freeze. He mentioned it because of the weaken afterwards, which can still help a lot. But
Siege Engine
whatever.
Before Ultra Form and Kachi Kachi, these units are really good picks to stop enemies from advancing from just weakening. But the impact of weaken
Pikaland is both weaken and freeze, so that's kind of contradictive. But
despite these units being able to heavily slow down enemies' pushes with great consistency, or even potentially perma-stalling with a good enough tanky meat shields, unfortunately, their effects just doesn't look that obvious. Honestly, one of the main reasons on why I'm making this video in the first place is, frankly, the amount of people that forget that Thaumaturge exists. Thauma's an amazing unit.
It's so easy to forget about Thaumaturge. It's so easy to forget. I'm so sorry.
It often gets forgotten by players because, well, it's weaken, and weaken just doesn't look that powerful. While in reality, there's so many cases where Thaumaturge often outperforms.
You know, because of this video, I think I really want new Luna, the Dark Luna, because of her weaken. I really want to see if her weaken is, like, really good. Because I think the main problem we have with weaken is the fact that we don't have a lot of units that weaken in addition to dealing damage, like we do slow and freeze. So, like, I feel like that's the main reason why weaken doesn't really get looked at all that often, is because we don't have crazy Ubers that weaken. We have Dark Phono with slow, Mitama with slow, we have Light Luna with slow, we have Chronos with freeze, we have Pikaland with freeze. People know him for his freeze, not his weaken. I'm sure we have others, because there's a lot of like freezing Ubers that are like known to be really good against their specific trait and stuff, but still good damage. Meanwhile, we don't exactly have that for weaken, because weaken's associated with tanking rather than damage, and people like bigger damage rather than bigger HP. Imagine Gothic Mitama instead of slow, its damage. You know? That doesn't sound that bad. Honestly, her weaken's really good on its own.
The quote-unquote popular picks. Like I've mentioned, Thaumaturge is one of the best counter for Borophim, yet most players would often forget about Thaumaturge and just bring Sanzo for Borophim. And honestly, I think Sanzo almost always performs worse than Thaumaturge against Borophim. Thaumaturge is so much more consistent, it saves up your money, and doesn't force you to push after
True.
knocking Borophim back, which can be sometimes
I
problematic.
haven't
if
even
there's a
talented
backline.
Sanzo for
There's
anti-angels,
very few
and
stages where
I would
think
probably
Sanzo
agree
might
with
be a
this.
better pick compared to Thaumaturge, like Holy Exploit and...
Or on my new account, I haven't talented Sanzo.
I think that's
On my
about
old
it.
account, I did.
Maybe Seabreeze Salon to an extent, but honestly, there's an argument that Thaumaturge is also really good for a better...
Mainly, I think Thaumaturge is mainly better there because he can weaken all three. Thaumaturge's best advantage is being able to target anything other than metals. That is his best advantage. You probably should have used Thalma on 34. Thalma on 34 would have been good. However, I still feel like Professor Catjobs. In stages where Professor Catjobs doesn't work, use Thaumaturge. But like, I think you're underestimating Catjobs because on floor 34, Catjobs does the job just fine.
Start off at the stage, so okay, I'm stopping myself before I go on.
Even
a
without
Point
weaken
is,
effect up.
Thaumaturge is extremely underrated. Consistency aside, she
Yeah,
gets some
Thaumaturge is
great pluses like
underrated,
her
though.
weightless targeting and wave immunity. Plus, her range is also really good. 310 range is pretty high. It outranges majority of waiver enemies and many mid-range bosses like Craze Cat,
You're not gonna have Stone early game.
Ranges Rainby variant. That is rare for a rare unit. Wow, I should have thought about that before putting it in the script. But anyways, I'm not
Wow.
saying that like Thaumaturge works every time, of course. She's still single target, has a very long attack startup. Her stats aren't good. She can't really survive that long. But like, she still gets glossed over way too much for how powerful she is. And this includes other
I'm guilty of
weaken-based
that.
units in general. A lot of them are really good, but they get easily overlooked. Weaken is a very powerful ability, and if you
I think
haven't
Vega's
already, you
really
should
underrated.
try more weaken units.
A lot of people really underestimate Vega. Like looking at Vega's stats in addition to her weaken, like she's really good in my opinion.
Appreciate more weaken
Even
units.
before her true
it might
form.
be harder to look at the impact of weaken, but weaken is not only great for stalling, it has many unique properties that makes it very versatile and potentially can break some stages too. But yeah, that's about it. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you have any thoughts or questions, you can leave it in the comments, or if you have some favorite weaken units, tell me about it too. Recently,
Vega's
I've
my
tried
favorite.
Mamaluga
And
in
Professor
ECU,
Catjobs.
and it's kind of nice actually. I really like the guy. But yeah, let me know if you have any thoughts.
Professor Catjobs and Vega are my two favorite weakeners. Super Cat is honorable mention. And yeah, Vega with 100% weaken would absolutely be
Questions or
insane.
Any favorite units in the comments that have
50% weaken just makes her
and I'll catch you
balanced,
another time.
but
See
she's
ya.
still really good. But yeah, if you did enjoy it, please do come back for more, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace!